Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 117 of Highest Power Church and State. Typically, I either cover a story related to the intersections of faith and politics myself, or I interview others about what's going on. But today, I'm going to be in the hot seat. Friday night, I went on the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast that's hosted by Kahnke. He's the author of A Christian Case Against Donald Trump, and he was once a church planter with the Baptist General Conference and Alliance for Renewal Churches. Our conversation ended up garnering over 31,000 views and 470 comments over the weekend, so I wanted to share it with you here. One of the ways the conversation around Christian nationalism in particular is evolving is that people are starting to realize the diversity of the movement. It's not a theologically univocal paradigm that can be easily identified and deconstructed. For example, the Holy Week events at the White House we've covered included Franklin Graham, Robert Jeffress, and Paula White, all at the podium together with Trump. And as I announced on social media last night, the main session for the worship service on the National Mall on May 17th, where Trump is planning to rededicate the United States to being under Jesus, is going to be led by none other than Mark Driscoll, of all people, the former Mars Hill church pastor who says women are penis homes, and that there is a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus, and by God's grace, it'll be a mountain by the time we're done. You either get on the bus, or you get run over by the bus. Those are the options. So, of course Trump would choose him for the main session. And of course, white evangelicals would go along without saying much. Before I play our conversation, though, I would like to share a couple thoughts about this painting that Trump posted on Truth Social last night. He posted this picture of Trump basically looking down at this sick man and healing him, and Trump is dressed in garbs that would depict him as Jesus, the white robe with the red around it. So suddenly, there's been a lot of outcry on social media today. A lot of evangelicals are out of nowhere admitting they have a problem with Trump. It's even gone so far to where Sean Foyt himself has said this needs to immediately come down. So some people are saying, finally, white evangelicals are starting to see what's going on with Trump and are complaining about something. But to me, what's happening here is kind of a picture of the real problem going on here. And that is that people are outraged not over the harm Trump has caused to the empire's least of these. They're not outraged over him bragging about sexually assaulting women. They're not outraged over what he's done to immigrants. They're not outraged over him waging a holy war that has blown up in elementary school of children. They're not outraged over any of these things he's done to the least of these. They're not outraged over the Epstein files. All of these things they're pretty quiet about until Trump dresses up like Jesus. And what they're really outraged about is the dishonoring of Jesus. And while I understand that, this would be dishonoring of Jesus to depict Jesus as Trump, basically, I think the motivation here matters, because they're not motivated by the oppression of the least of these. They're motivated by the dishonoring of the highest power. That's how they define Jesus. To put it in Mark Driscoll terms, white evangelicals aren't moved by the bodies under the bus. They just care about honor being given to the highest power. So they don't actually identify a Jesus who is with the bodies under the bus. They identify a Jesus that is lording over everyone, demanding honor. And is that the Jesus we see revealed in the Sermon on the Mount and at the cross? Or is it a different Jesus? One made in the image of white evangelicals and their values. Because if you look at Jesus' teaching in Matthew 25, he talks about the king identifying as a brother and sister of the least of these. That basically those who are thirsty, those who are hungry, those who are naked, those who need, to be freed, that's who the king identifies with as his brothers and sisters. And so when white evangelicals are not moved by any of that, but they're moved by the dishonoring of the highest one, they're actually identifying a Jesus at the top of the empire, a Jesus that exerts power and authority over the least of these. They're not actually changing at all. This is really just revelatory of the fact that they value the highest power and honoring the highest power. This is more of the same. Even though it may look like, oh, finally, they're willing to say something negative about Trump, it's really more of the same. Because they're identifying Jesus as being at the top of the hierarchy who needs honor and loyalty, and not a Jesus who identifies in and among the oppressed. So there are a lot of different theologies among these Christian nationalists. But despite the variety of their perspectives, they do have some things in common, besides simply loyalty to Trump, especially as we're seeing in this story. And we often find these common values of power and authority and submission and honor revealed in their worship. So in my conversation with Pat Kahnke, we discussed some of these values that these diverse Christian nationalist expressions hold in common.
Well, hey, everybody. If you've been around this channel for a while, you know that when Charlie Kirk was assassinated and they had the big Charlie Kirk memorial, I talked about several of the speakers. But what you might not know is that when I watched that memorial, I intentionally skipped all the music. And the reason I did is because as somebody who's been involved in, as a worship leader and as a pastor who played on worship teams for years, it was just painful. It's become very painful to watch the way that worship music gets used in some of these contexts. So my guest is Rick Pidcock, and the book that he wrote is, I think, about one of the most important and overlooked aspects of the MAGA movement and, sort of right-wing Christianity in general. The book is called Weapons of Worship: How the Songs of Evangelicalism Form the Soundtrack of Extremism. So I want to get into that. So welcome, Rick Pidcock. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Rick writes for Baptist News Global on a weekly basis. He also hosts the podcast Highest Power, Church and State. But yeah, Rick, so I met you because I read some things that you wrote, and I was like, I just have to meet this guy because he resonates so much with the things that I'm talking about. It seems like the overlap of what you write about and what I talk about on this channel is like the Venn diagram is almost a perfect circle. What would you say for somebody who's never thought about this, who just shows up to church and is singing songs, and maybe a lot of them are from Bethel Music or some of these other groups that you talk about in your book? What's the problem that you're writing the book about? Why is it called Weapons of Worship? What's the problem you're addressing?
So, in a very in-your-face way, you'll notice a lot more events over the last couple years, especially of these worship leaders who are basically doing this like a church service outside in a park or at a political rally. And it's like, basically, think about like a church service or an evangelistic meeting, and you've got like a time of worship, and then you've got the speaker come up. But instead of like a speaker, it's a politician. And instead of a sermon based on the Bible, it's a sermon based on the GOP platform. And so basically, like, the songs, in one sense, are setting people up and conditioning them emotionally to accept those politicians' messages. And of course, they're all, Trump supporters. But basically what they're doing is they're also, they're basically helping people get this vision of basically wanting to seek power over their neighbors and to wage spiritual warfare against their neighbors. And so some of that's going to be more in your face, but also a lot of it is using songs that people sing every day on, Sunday mornings in their local megachurch. And so there's just a lot of things that people aren't noticing. A lot of people may not go to a Sean Foyt event in a park. They may just want to put their kids in kids' church and go sing some cool songs with their worship team, and they're not going to really recognize how they're also being formed to wage spiritual warfare against their neighbors too.
You've talked before about this worship event that really was warfare. Tell me about that. Just describe it for people, what you witnessed.
So that was actually an event in Seattle this last year. But basically, like, what they would do is they targeted this neighborhood that had a lot of LGBTQ people living there. They went to the park, they set up a sign with these big pink and blue banners that said, "Don't mess with our kids." And basically, they were there to wage spiritual warfare through worship. And so they have these huge speakers. They're blasting this worship music. And they have person after person coming up and giving testimony about how they became an evangelical and changed their sexual orientation. Mm. And so then, but then they're, obviously, it's going to draw protesters around the perimeter.
That's the intent of it, I assume.
Yeah. And so there's these protesters around the perimeter, and then the people at the mics start yelling at the protesters. And so, like, one person was like, "You want to throw down with me? Come on, let's go, let's go." And then, like, another one was basically speaking to them as if they were demons. And, like, a lot of people, they'll admit, okay, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities and powers in heavenly places. And so that guy, it was as if he was speaking to demons, like yelling, "Quiet, cut your voices, cut. You get out right now." But like from the perspective of the protesters, demons are invisible, So like all they know is this guy's staring at them, yelling, "Get out, your voice is cut, fall to the ground," as police officers are literally pushing them to the ground.
Wow.
And like another one of the worship leaders doing this whole David and Goliath enactment, he said to everybody, "Get your rocks ready." And so everybody reaches down to the ground, picks up rocks, like imaginary invisible rocks. And he says, "Now we're going to release the roar and throw your rocks." And so all these people are like doing this throwing motion. Well, if you're an LGBTQ person on the perimeter, you don't know these are invisible rocks.
Right.
So the whole thing is just, it's not a peaceful worship gathering. It's all antagonistic, and it's all meant to drum up anger. And that's exactly what happened. And so, it ended up with a bunch of arrests and a bunch of neighbors who felt very dehumanized and exiled.
Yeah. And that brings me back to why I couldn't watch the music parts of the Charlie Kirk Memorial, because even though they're not doing that, acting out, throwing rocks and everything, the whole thing was an us against them. That it was a very programmed event that says we're the good guys, they're the bad guys that shot Charlie. And by the way, the people who shot Charlie are anyone who disagrees with Charlie, anyone who disagrees with Donald Trump. And we've got the worship music to prove that we're the ones who love God and God loves us. That's the hardest thing for me to stomach in all of it.
Yeah. And that's where it was like, what was so frustrating is you had a Stephen Miller up there yelling to us who won't submit to them. He was yelling, "You are nothing. You have nothing. You can create nothing." And then you've got all these worship leaders like drumming everybody up emotionally in between those messages. Trump said, "I hate my enemies." And then the worship leaders come in and they're singing songs about the highest power and all this kind of stuff. And then after the event was over, the worship leaders were interviewed. A lot of them were interviewed, and none of them ever said anything about concerns about their music being used for political manipulation. They were all talking about the glow of the event. Like Chris Tomlin was even talking about how he said, "I'm still lost in the glow of it." Like, yeah. And that's what's just so frustrating is these aren't just some wild Sean Foyt guy or some no-name person out on the fringes at some event in the backwoods of Idaho. Like, these are the main people who are leading the worship industry.
Exactly. And what I hope people come to realize is that this whole structure, it includes Christian radio. Trump speaks at the religious broadcasting, conferences every year, and there's this, and people listen to this stuff and they just think, I see the signs for our local radio station here that, uplifting music for your drive. As worship leaders, both of us, I think about the lyrics to the songs, but I wonder, to the average person who's just singing those songs, how much they're thinking about the words and how much it's more just getting into a mode.
Yeah, because like the other day, for example, I played a video for my wife of these people that it was on some video that was shared on Twitter of this mega church. These guys were splashing in this water, and it was this over the top, typical cheesy mega church type video. And the worship song that was playing with it was "Praises the Water My Enemies Drown In," which is an elevation song. And so I mentioned it, and then my daughter was in the room, and she doesn't really know any of the stuff that I write about and everything like this,
Mm-hmm.
So she said, "What, do you not like that song?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, it says praises the water my enemies drown in." It's literally talking about people drowning in a very excited way. And she said, "Oh, she said, I just really like the vibe." And
Interesting.
I was like, well, that's kind of how this works. A lot of people, they love the vibe of these songs, and it kind of goes over their head of like, wait a minute, in my brain, I'm experiencing feelings of excitement while singing about my neighbors drowning.
Yeah.
And eventually that's going to shape your posture towards your neighbors.
Yeah, because I thought about that. It's funny, I wrote down the line, "Praises the water my enemies drown in." So your daughter, for instance, maybe what she could respond to you, if you talk to her about this is, well, but it's just metaphorical. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, but what's it a metaphor for? What's mm-hmm. the good meaning of this?
Yeah, like you look at the way, and like kind of sticking on the children's thing, I have a whole chapter in the book on children's worship music. And if you look at a lot of children's worship music, it's all based on, a lot of it is the supposedly exciting parts of the Bible, which just so happen to be the Canaanite conquest narratives. And so a lot of them, the songs, at the end of a song, it's about somebody dropping dead and getting their head chopped off, or the 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. And so it's the story of these 12 men who go into Canaan, and they're going to spy out the land, and to, consider whether or not they should go in and commit genocide. And then the 10 who say, no, let's not go commit genocide are bad. And the 2 who want to go commit genocide are good. And so then that's what kids in Sunday school, they're all excited. There was one song I mentioned in the thing, and they're like singing about Goliath, and like whack, 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 cut off his head. It's like, this is so violent.
So one of the things, like I talked about, the sort of, we were careful. I have a friend. He's a professor of musical composition, and he was on our worship team, and he's the one who really keyed me into this early on, about just the way that, and you talk about in your book too, certain chord progressions you can use. There's this manipulative thing. That if you really understand music, and I understand music on like a gut level. I'm not a trained music. I've led worship for years and stuff, played in bands, but I'm one of these guys that really doesn't know what I'm doing. And I knew, as just a guy who was leading music, that there were certain times where if the drummer hit the snare in a certain way at a certain time, and there were certain chords being played, that people would invariably come up to me afterwards and say, "Wow, the Spirit really moved." And how do you deal with that as somebody who's trying to help people to enter into worship, what does it even mean to enter into worship? True worship, as opposed to what I'm describing there.
Yeah, there's this, you often think of like, a lot of people may not understand like certain musical terminology, But a lot of people will understand if you have a song in a minor key, it sounds kind of spooky and dark. And like you can have like a bright major key sounding thing, you know? But like then on a more specific level, you can get into different chord progressions. And some songs, like they'll end on a chord that's like, it's the one chord. It's the main chord of the song. It just sounds done when the song ends. And then some songs will end on the 5 chord, and it sounds very unstable when it ends. You're like, it just needs to have one more strum. Like, please do the one more strum. And you're left with this feeling of it's not quite done. So it's unresolved. And so musicians and bands can do that. Maybe they want you to feel unresolved.
Right.
Maybe they want you to feel darkness. Maybe they want you to feel excitement. And so, you know, a skilled musician can craft a worship set in a way that's going to take you on an emotional journey. And like in that, I think it's the first chapter of my book, I mention this concept called collective effervescence. And it's a term where basically it's about the emotion that people feel and the connection that they feel when they're all together in a room. And this isn't just a Christian worship thing. This is something you'll feel at a rock concert. But then there's these worship leaders who will talk about how when they enter into the space emotionally with the band and with the others in the congregation, they'll talk about how your mind shuts down and your spirit just takes over. And it's like, well, what I'm trying to bring to this conversation is, no, your mind doesn't actually shut down. Your brain is making connections. It's firing together, and now you're not thinking. You may lack awareness of what's happening, but you are most definitely being influenced to become excited about waging war against your neighbors instead of loving them.
So you did say that in these, praise in the park type situations or whatever, there would be a worship band playing, but then instead of a pastor, a politician gets up, and you describe this on the National Mall in your book. And I just want to read this and have you comment on it. This is just a paragraph from your book. You say, back at the National Mall, and this is a Sean Foyt event, I believe you were talking about. Back at the National Mall, after more songs about joyfully embracing power and punishment, Senator Josh Hawley takes the stage. The constant interplay of worship and preaching works together so that the worship guides the emotions, lowers the inhibitions, and opens the heart toward the more explicit calls of the speakers. As evangelicals often say, worship prepares the hearts for the sermon. With the band playing a constant soundtrack underneath his words, Hawley begins, "You and I both know what's made our country truly great. It's the spiritual foundations of this nation. It's the truth of the Bible on which this nation was founded." And Rick, when I read that paragraph, the thing that just gave me the creeps was this idea of the musical soundtrack playing underneath.
Yeah, and he talks about, in that passage where I quote him, he's talking about going back to the biblical foundations upon which our nation was founded and not giving up the inheritance of our fathers. He talks a lot about, and it's like, well, okay, but what do you mean by that? And so, like, because we had slavery and we had the whole genocide of the Native Americans. And so, for example, in one of my chapters, I have a whole chapter on race and ethnicity where I get into like how specifically worship songs were utilized to motivate people for the genocide against Native Americans. And like, I specifically give Native American perspectives from their scholars about how that affected them, or specific examples of songs. Or there was Captain John Mason was a military commander who utilized worship in his genocide of the Pequot tribe. And we have an entire book of his autobiography, basically, of his wars that he fought. And so we actually can, like, it's not just some modern liberal scholar making something up. Like, it's actually in his own words how he utilized worship. And so bringing some of that historical perspective, it brings a lot more context than Josh Hawley getting up there and just spouting off, not giving up the inheritance of our fathers. Like, what does that even mean?
So on a practical level, we just see a lot of worship music being played. It's used in a lot of different settings that some of them I think we both find distressing. We hear about things going on at the Pentagon, with Pete Hegseth leading prayer services there. Some of the things that he says. We've got Sean Foyt doing his thing. He's had some scandals recently, but out of Bethel Music. But then you've got people who go to church and are participating in praise and worship. Talk to me about these different types of ways that it's being used, because it seems to be there's very different purposes.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that can be difficult to talk about with this topic because, a John Piper, for example, he's of a very different mindset than a Sean Foyt. A John MacArthur is a very different mindset than a Sean Foyt. Like, there are charismatics, there are non-charismatics. There's, even within each of those worlds, there's a whole variety of ways of interpreting things. And so you can't just treat the whole issue as if it's this univocal thing. A megachurch Sunday morning worship service is when you're just concerned about sipping your coffee and having a fun time with the worship band is very different than going to a park in Seattle and waging warfare against your LGBTQ neighbors and picking up imaginary rocks and pretending to throw at them and yelling at them while police are kneeing them in the back. Like, those are just two completely fundamentally different experiences. And that's very different than like Pete Hegseth inviting Doug Wilson and different Christian nationalist worship leaders to the Pentagon for his services. And so while these are very different manifestations of the issue, they're all really drawing their inspiration from the Bible. And at a very basic level, the Bible was written during a time of empire. It was written when the Israelites were under the boot of empire. It was written when first century Jews were under the boot of the Roman Empire. And so in a very human level, they're using in the Bible, they're using these empire type relationships because that's what they knew. Like, they're processing. There are categories called masters and slaves. So they're going to process their theology in light of the master-slave relationship. And so basically, like, ancient hierarchies, they worked in a way that strengthened the power of those at the top, that dehumanized those below, and that waged war against those who wouldn't submit. And those are the dynamics that we see throughout Scripture. Like, it doesn't mean that the Bible's always choosing the side of the powerful. I'm not saying that, because Israel was on the underside of empire, but those were the categories they were talking in. And so you look at these different events today, and when they're using that language, that ancient language of authority and submission, they're talking about worship in a way that's bending the knee to an overlord. Like, they're basically just reenacting ancient empire dynamics. And so it's going to look different in these different contexts, but the dynamics that it's creating are going to be very similar.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is what you're touching on there is this authority piece. And this is the thing that comes through everything that I end up talking about on this channel, is the authoritarian impulse in our country's politics, but the authoritarian impulse in evangelical Christianity. And the two, when people are confused about why evangelicals would, white evangelicals would support somebody like Donald Trump or that movement, I think once you understand the authority piece, it really starts to make sense. And when the whole movement is about submitting to authority and it's being acted out, I don't know if you would say it this way, but it's almost this worship can become a ritual act of submission to the authority of God, but it's very easy then to transfer that authority onto a leader in a worship setting, I think.
Yeah, and the problem is that it doesn't just stay there. With Christian theology, evangelical theology, it's about going and taking the gospel to the nations, making disciples of the nations. It doesn't just end within the four walls of a church. This is why the dynamics within the four walls of a church are so important, because in the Great Commission, it goes beyond those four walls. And so if you have a healthy dynamic where within the four walls people are loving their neighbors as themselves, and that goes beyond the four walls, then that could spread fruit that's actually healthy. But when you've got these power dynamics of authorities and submission within the church walls that are very gendered, very age driven, and that even have racial and ethnic implications, you expand those beyond the four walls of the church out into the community, then suddenly you're going to find yourself in the situation that we're finding ourselves today.
Yeah. So this is a huge topic, and this is a topic I care deeply about, and we're just scratching the surface here. And Rick's book comes out on September 29th, is that correct?
Yes.
And so, but it's available for pre-order now, and I'll put a link down in the description below. But I am so grateful that you wrote the book, and I want to have you back on here once it comes out, and we can go deep into the book itself then.
Yeah, it feels like so long, for the book to come out, especially from the writing process too. And I'm kind of in this weird place right now where it's like kind of a waiting game. But I'm also I'm doing the audiobook myself, and I'm going to be doing, putting some audio even within it from some of the events I've covered, because a lot of the events are places that I went to in person. And so that'll be something for people to look forward to as well. It won't just be getting just my description of things, but some, experiences of hearing the sounds as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I know the first place that I heard any of that was on your podcast. So you want to mention your podcast again, where people can find that?
Yeah, so I do a podcast for Baptist News Global twice a week. It's every Monday and Thursday. It's called Highest Power Church and State. And it's not just about the worship stuff, but it's about basically the intersection of the highest places of power between religion and government. And there's plenty of stories to explore with that these days, especially. So.
Mm-hmm. And you're on Substack too?
Yes. Substack Exiles in Christendom is what I name my Substack.
Yeah. So check out Rick Pidcock's work. It's everywhere. And I would highly recommend this book. I've read some of it, and I'm just enjoying it so much. So I really recommend it. And just thank you for coming on here, and we'll talk to you again, September, October, once the book is out, and we'll go deep into the book itself. So okay. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thank you everyone for listening.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.